All right, this is the video notes for Chapter 14, Section 1, Part 3. And again, we're continuing to look at how genes and genetic traits are being passed down from parents to offspring. So we talked a little bit about blood type. Now we're going to give some examples of some human disorders from recessive alleles. Again, we have a lot of different ones that are caused by that, and we're going to touch on 5. Albinism, cystic fibrosis, galactosemia, phenylketonuria, which we call PKU, just so we don't have to say that long word, and Tay-Sachs disease. Again, this has to do with the fact that there's the recessive trait. So there has to be 2 of the lowercase letters in order for individuals to express this trait. And if I go back here, again, reminder, these are all dealing with the autosomal chromosomes, so the ones that are not involved in distinguishing the sex. So everything other than chromosomes 23, these are all recessive alleles that have to do with the autosomal chromosomes. Albinism just has to do with a lack of pigment in the skin, the hair, and the eyes. Cystic fibrosis, we're actually going to talk about it in a little bit, but there is excess mucus in the lungs and therefore an increased susceptibility to infection. Galactosemia is a recessive disorder that leads to the accumulation of galactose in tissues. Galactose is part of a bigger sugar, fructose, and what happens is the body cannot break that down. And remember back from our cellular respiration, the body needs those sugars to produce energy. So it can lead to a bunch of different issues, specifically issues with the brain development as well as eye and liver damage. The phenylketonuria, which is called PKU, has too much of the phenylene in tissues, and basically that can lead to lack of normal skin pigment and mental deficiency. And where we kind of see issues with this is in people's diets. So those that like to drink diet sodas that have aspartame, anyone that has PKU is going to have some side effects by drinking anything in there that has that aspartame. And galactosemia and phenylketonuria, they are all caused by specific mutations that cause normal functions that occur in the body to not happen like they should. The last one that we had on here is Tay-Sachs disease. And a lot of you notice with these recessive is we get this accumulation of different things. Well, in Tay-Sachs, the lysosomes, which kind of break down some of the lipids and other materials within the cell, they cannot break those down. So you get accumulation of these, and it can lead to mental deficiencies, blindness, and death in early childhood. So these really focused on recessive alleles. So individuals can be carriers for that, meaning they will carry the trait but not express it. In order to express it, they need to have both of the alleles. So those focused on the recessive, but we also have the dominant alleles. And this means that anyone that carries that gene is going to express that. These aren't as common and normally are not as life-threatening as some of the recessive disorders that are passed on until later in life. So we have 3 that we'll look at: achondroplasia, Huntington's disease, and hypercholesterolemia. So achondroplasia is a form of dwarfism. So anyone who has that trait is going to express it, and they're going to have dwarfism. Huntington's disease is a mental deterioration, and you get uncontrollable movements with that. Symptoms generally appear when individuals are a little bit older. Same with hypocholesterolemia. There's this excess cholesterol in the blood and can cause heart disease, which can lead to a bunch of different issues involving the heart and the circulatory system. So we've talked about recessive alleles causing some disorders, dominant alleles. We also have the codominant alleles that can wreak some havoc. And one of the most common disorders caused by the codominant is the sickle cell disease. And what happens is you get these red blood cells that are misshapen and damage to many of the cells. So this, if we look at down here, this is the misshapen cell, and this is kind of your normal blood cell. So we have this kind of mutation that is going to cause some issues with how our blood cells actually look. And the interesting thing about this one is found in 1 in 500 African Americans. But we're going to look a little bit more about sickle cell in just a little bit. So the thing is we've had this Human Genome Project where we've been trying to map out where all the genetic traits are coming from on those chromosomes. And for some of the diseases, because they've fully mapped the human genome, we actually know where some of these disorders are caused and what is kind of happening at that piece. Cystic fibrosis and sickle cell are one of those that we actually know. There's a lot of others that we don't know. But for these, we know the gene that controls this disorder is actually going to alter the structure of a specific protein. So we're going to skip ahead a little bit and look at cystic fibrosis. So cystic fibrosis is caused by a recessive allele on chromosome number 7. And it causes digestive problems along with the production of a heavy mucus that clogs the lungs and the breathing passageway. This disorder causes the chloride ions, the Cl-, to be unable to pass across membranes, causing the tissues to malfunction. So because there was kind of this mutation and this altered structure, these chloride ions can no longer pass across the membranes, and that causes all these issues. Think back to osmosis diffusion and the amount of materials that need to come in and out of the cell. And when you have cystic fibrosis, those chloride ions especially are not able to do that like they should. Again, this is just kind of a little closer up as to what actually happens. So you have this build up of mucus kind of in the air passageways that are going to restrict the body's ability to get the necessary oxygen. And there's going to be lots of congestion in there and possibly infection and malabsorption of nutrients also in the pancreas. So when we look at the pancreas as well, there's going to be issues associated with that. And cystic fibrosis, again, is one that is passed down by the recessive allele. When we look at the sickle cell disease, the protein mutation actually causes a mutation in the hemoglobin itself. And so how it's going to look like. So if we look at this diagram here, this is our normal hemoglobin. And this is the sickle cell hemoglobin. And note that the sickle cell hemoglobin image is drawn at 50% of the size of the normal hemoglobin. So you have this variation in size and shape. And when we go back to that original picture of what those look like, this can wreak some big havoc when you think about where the blood needs to go, where these red blood cells need to go. And what happens is you have these sickle cells that tend to get stuck in capillaries and then are going to back up the blood flow. The change in the DNA alters the amino acid valine for glutamic acid, which makes the hemoglobin less soluble and causes those issues. However, we've been talking about how there has been all these issues with how mutations in genes can be passed on and you have these genetic disorders. Well, the weird thing is sometimes these mutations might actually be helpful. In Africa, those that have this, that are heterozygous for sickle cell disease are actually resistant to malaria. And so if we look at this kind of sickle cell versus malaria, areas where malaria is common has a higher prevalence of kind of the sickle cell disease. And one of the things that this kind of plays a role in is this idea of how genes are passed on. And in sickle cell, what happens is you get these kind of weird shaped genes that are weird shaped blood cells that the body is then going to attack. The body's going to go in, attack these blood cells, and while they do that, they are actually taking care of the parasite that is responsible for malaria. So individuals who have kind of that heterozygous, carry that trait, are going to be resistant to that. So there are some good things that kind of come out of some different mutations. The last piece that we really want to kind of focus on is this idea of genes and the environment. How does the environment play a role? We know that we get specific genes from our parents, but why are sometimes those genes expressed more highly than others? And part of it has to do with environmental factors. They're going to play a role in how much the gene is expressed. So basically, how much of the phenotype are we going to see? Non-genetic factors might include things like nutrition, exercise, and one example that we look at is the average height has increased over 10 centimeters since the mid-1800s. So what has been happening is as our knowledge about nutrition and exercise, as that grow and people are eating better and living better, we are going to see more of that phenotype for tall being expressed. So the key here that I would really highlight is the full potential of genes can only be expressed to its full potential when they're in an ideal environment. So when the conditions are right. So if you have a gene for being tall, but you're malnourished, you're not going to exhibit that phenotype that we might expect when we look at your genetics. So this gave you just a quick little snapshot. What we're going to do is we're just going to practice this. This is nothing new. We are just putting some different disorders to some of the Punnett squares that we have been doing. This ends the video notes for section 1 of chapter 14.